So, as you know, the holidays are over, and yet still I'm experimenting with this dish I made for the last Christmas Eve. It all started with me wanting to prepare something different. And I remembered an experience from many years ago. I had spent a Christmas Eve with a Brazilian family. Now, all of their food was really good, but there was this one special dish, and it was called Bacalao, or codfish stew. Having originated debatably in either Portugal or Spain, depending on your source, it became a traditional dish in both countries, and later in many other colonized countries in Latin America, including Brazil. Today I'd like to talk about this dish, Bacalao, what it is, why it did become a tradition in Portugal and Spain, and some tips on how to prepare it. Now, the word bacalao in Portuguese or bacalao in Spanish, it literally translates to mean cod or codfish. But often when people are talking about bacalao, they're referring to this fish stew made with specifically dried salted cod. And to understand the emphasis on the salted cod, I was reading through many commentaries from food critics. My favorite was from Tom Gilbert, called Salt Cod, the prosciutto of the sea. He explains the drying and salting process and how it creates a meatier, more flavorful fish than its fresh counterpart, comparable to prosciutto or other salt-cured hams as opposed to fresh pork. Although the popular use of salt cod came about not because of its unique flavors of great complexity, quoting Gilbert, but for practical reasons. Author Mark Kurlansky, in his book A Biography of the Fish That Changed the World, writes extensively about the history of cod, from its origins in the North Atlantic Sea to the fishermen, the Scandinavian peoples. He explains how hundreds of years ago it was considered an abundant, humble fish, a comfort food eaten by the masses. And they always ate it fresh, fried or boiled, and in simple recipes with butter or sour cream, served with boiled potatoes and carrots. The salting concept came from the Mediterranean. I found out the food critics don't agree. Some claim it was the Portuguese, others claim that it was the Spaniards that introduced salting to the Scandinavians. But author Kurlansky insisted it was the Basques. Some actually refer to them as the Spanish Basques, but they're a very different culture and speak a very different language than either the Spaniards or the Portuguese. So he wrote that the Basques had the original monopoly, acquiring the cod from the Scandinavians and selling it in the Mediterranean. They had already been salting and selling whale meat, but the codfish became a much more valued commodity. And the reason why is because it's very low fat content, which means when you preserve it with salt, it lasts for a much longer time. Kurlansky writes as long as 2 years. And the reason why such a long preservation was important was because of the population that the Basques were selling to. The Portuguese and the Spaniards were predominantly Catholic, and with their religious practices of abstaining from meat, they needed to have on hand fish. Kurlansky writes that their practices were much more extensive 100 years ago, fasting not only the 40 days of Lent, but all and every single Friday, plus many other days of vigil no longer practiced, such as the vigil of Christmas Eve. To quote Kurlansky, in total, meat was forbidden for almost half the days of the year, and those lean days eventually became salt cod days. Now, for me, it's no wonder we have such great recipes of salt cod. If you have to eat it for about half the days of the year, you're probably going to become creative about preparing it. And the other thing is, and this is a personal preference, but I think that the Mediterraneans have had access to all the best ingredients in the world, including tomatoes, onion, garlic, olive oil, all which are still abundant. Unfortunately, presently, because of overfishing and worldwide overconsumption, cod is no longer abundant, nor is it cheap. I found that out firsthand in my attempts to buy cod locally. I called all the local specialty and food stores and fish stores in the greater Kansas City area where I'm from, and no one had it and no one knew where to get it. Of course, you can get anything online, which I did look up. The cheapest I found was $10 per pound for cod with a minimum purchase of 2 pounds. And I also found cheaper alternatives. Their products sold as salt cod but derived from other white fish. But before I resorted to ordering online, I got lucky. A co-worker, actually originally from the Dominican Republic, suggested I go to La Posada, which is a store that's actually down the street from where I work. I'd seen it, but I'd never been in it. It's a small family-owned neighborhood store. And I did go. And when I went in to ask for it, it was an elderly gentleman who helped me. And it was cute. He got this twinkle in his eye and said, "You want bacalao?" And held up his finger as if to say, "Hang on," and disappeared. And when he came back, he had this rather large wooden crate that he had to pry open. And inside was my prize. These very large fillets covered with salt. They cost me $10.21 a pound. And the fillet I bought, actually all the fillets were about 2 pounds. But I was happy to have my prize. I want to share some tips I learned about preparing codfish stew. The rinsing and the soaking of the salt cod is by far the most important thing. You have to at least soak it for 24 hours, and you have to rinse it at least 4 to 5 times. What's important to know is you need a pot that it must be large enough to easily immerse the fish. And you've got to rinse thoroughly and repeatedly. Now, there are many recipe variations on the internet. I've made 3 versions, and that's not including the Spanish chorizo one I've recently found and am planning to make. But don't let that intimidate you, because it doesn't have to be a time-consuming or complicated thing. First of all, when you're not rinsing your salt cod, you simply leave it in the fridge. And although there are, as I said, many recipe variations, the process can be very simple. I mean, basically, you just saute everything in olive oil, and then you throw it in a pot with some liquid and let it cook for 20 to 30 minutes. And then you have a gorgeous, delicious meal. Specifically, I'll say you saute onions, garlic, fish, of course fish. Then you can add bell peppers and or spicy peppers. I like both, and olives. And you just add it all to the pot with stewed tomatoes and or red wine. Again, I like both. And then before you serve it, add cilantro, parsley. Some additional favorites of mine are boiled potatoes and hard-boiled eggs, which you add right at the last. Now, there is one important requisite. Obviously, you have to like fish. And if you do, then you probably will love the prosciutto of the sea. Today I've talked about the dish bacalao, what it is, why it became a tradition in Portugal and Spain, and some tips on how to prepare it. I hope you'll try it out. In closing, I'll say, as the Brazilians taught me, bom proveito. Enjoy.